From the producers of Age of Audio, Oxford Road presents a Media Roundtable special series, What's a Podcast? The Revolution Redefined. Throughout this series, you'll hear Dan Granger talking with the pioneers who built podcasting from the ground up. These creators, executives, and visionaries didn't just shape an industry. They created something special. And Dan's not just after their stories. He's on a mission to understand the soul of podcasting and protect what makes it unique before it loses its identity to flashier, more visual formats demanding our attention. In our first episode, we heard about podcasting's early days through 2013. Today, we're diving into the explosive growth that followed, that moment when podcasting went mainstream, the wild, stupid money, as some have called it, that flew around after that, and how a global pandemic changed everything again. Act 1, the serial shift. So let's pick up where we left off. For its first 10 years, podcasting was this small, beloved thing, a niche medium with a dedicated fan base, but totally off the radar for most people. Sure, the tech was getting better, but finding shows was still a pain, and making money? Probably easier to do that writing poetry. But then 2014 rolled around, and everything changed with just one show.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig.
One day, a tiny universe where very few shows reached 1 million downloads a month, and the next day, it was like all the media companies in America wanted in. You heard it in every business meeting. We went from explaining the basics, like the iPod, to everybody saying, we want to make a show like Serial. How do we get us one of those?
By 2014, when Serial became all the rage, we had already launched the business. So we were full steam ahead, helping create infrastructure around the industry. So when it happened, we watched the phenomenon that we were already aware of really start to get serious.
Serial created a new kind of audio addiction. If you were riding the subway in New York that season and it was Thursday morning, it seemed like every last person had the Serial logo on their screen, earbuds in their ears listening. Hernan Lopez, founder of the successful podcasting network Wondery, remembers where he was when the Serial revolution happened.
I was coming back from a plane from London, which is an 11-hour flight, and I binge listened to the last, I believe it was 5 episodes of Serial in a row. I could not put it down. And then I really understood the power of that immersive story, very told from a perspective that you essentially thought that you were a person in between Sarah Koenig and Adnan, and you really were feeling the feelings that both of them were communicating to each other when they were having those conversations.
But there was this other thing that Serial did, something most radio shows or TV shows or any other podcast in those early days did not do. It literally changed a man's life.
Major development this morning in a murder case followed by millions of people thanks to the podcast Serial. The young man who's claimed all along that he's innocent may finally be getting a break.
Now, a judge in the United States has quashed the murder conviction of an American man whose case gave rise to the true crime podcast Serial.
8 years after Serial first hit our earbuds, Adnan Syed walked free. A judge threw out his murder conviction, and prosecutors later dropped all charges completely. The show put his case under a spotlight so bright that the justice system had to take another look.
This was the moment that proved podcasting could literally change someone's life and force society to re-examine itself. It facilitated a type of introspection that wasn't typical for media. But that power comes from the unique intimacy and immersion of audio storytelling. If video replaces that, that's where we start to risk losing podcasting's ability to engage our imaginations and maybe even its power to create meaningful change.
After Serial, nobody could ignore podcasting's power to create real change in the world. That it could engage millions of people in complex stories, spark national conversations, and even shake up the justice system. No wonder all these media executives and advertisers who ignored podcasting for so long finally saw the media's potential after Serial.
Then the 2024 election happened, and we haven't seen media play this big a clear role in the outcome of a U.S. presidential election since Nixon Kennedy in 1960. Now, all of a sudden, everybody knows that podcasting is a force of nature not to be trifled with.
Act 2, Going Hollywood. By 2016, podcasting wasn't just growing, it got glamorous. Hollywood discovered the medium, and suddenly actors, musicians, and reality TV stars all wanted their own show. You couldn't watch television or open social media without seeing a celebrity promoting their latest podcast. Bryan Barletta of Sounds Profitable points out how podcasting became a status symbol, even among global celebrities.
Meghan Markle gets on stage at South by Southwest and calls herself a podcaster. That's her title. Not a duchess, not an actress, a podcaster.
If you consider SNL any type of a bellwether for what's culturally relevant, SNL this last week just had Timothée Chalamet on. He was the featured host and musical performer.
Ladies and gentlemen, Timothée Chalamet.
And in that episode, they had not one, but two different sketches focused on podcasting.
School has invested in a new AI program that takes your textbooks and turns them into an educational podcast.
Whoa, AI can make a podcast?
That's why we developed Medcast, the doctor's appointment that feels like a podcast.
I think we've seen it everywhere. We see it in movies.
And podcast. Why do people call you podcast? Oh, I call myself podcast because of my podcast.
We see TV shows based around podcasting.
Tomorrow is my first official day as the boss of my new podcast company.
We got podcasts on podcasts on podcasts.
By 2017, there were even podcasts about podcasts, shows that recapped other shows. You know something's entered the zeitgeist when it generates its own meta-commentary. Podcasts like Homecoming and Dirty John were adapted into TV series. Only Murders in the Building is a TV series about a fictional podcast.
My favorite podcast just dropped a new episode tonight.
As well as drawing celebrities to the game, podcasting was creating its own celebrities. Take Alexandra Cooper, who went from relative obscurity to signing a $60 million deal with Spotify for her show, Call Her Daddy.
Alex Cooper.
6 years of Call Her Daddy.
Call Her Daddy. This is the thing. Everyone is talking about this.
Cooper's meteoric rise represented something new, a podcast native icon who bypassed traditional media entirely. Cooper eventually signed deals rivaling those of Joe Rogan and the Obamas, and showed how the medium could create stars, not just attract them. This Hollywood makeover changed the economics of the entire industry. Major podcast networks like Gimlet, Wondery, and The Ringer grew rapidly, offering production resources and marketing muscle that independent creators couldn't match. Traditional media companies launched podcast divisions, and platforms like Spotify began signing exclusive deals worth tens of millions of dollars.
The problem was the people that signed those deals didn't appreciate is how hard it is to build and hold an audience.
Dan says this period also saw massive consolidation, like with the network Wondery.
Hernan created what arguably has become the gold standard in podcasting and really showed how to build a beautiful business model, ended up exiting, selling it to Amazon in a story that was like right at the perfect moment when we were kind of peak consolidation. But it was a wonderful deal and a wonderful company. And really, he built a house of bricks that's standing strong today.
I raised $450,000 between my former employer and some angels, and then I thought it was going to be super easy, and boom, drew a blank for 2 years. I wasn't able to raise a Series A until 2018.
One of the things history teaches us about media is that when there's a new platform, there's usually an influx of performance marketers, because they're the ones that don't really care about traditional ratings and metrics, which a new media platform doesn't have. And so they're able to capitalize on that and get really good value and see really good response rates. In podcasting, that was instead of just going to a bunch of direct response brands that might be selling you something that wasn't necessarily helping, podcasting was fueled by true disruptors that were trying to reimagine industries.
As the industry grew more competitive, you couldn't really just casually succeed anymore. Ask Ben, Brett, and Jordan Meiselas. They're brothers and founders of the Midas Touch Network. What did it take? Here's Brett.
Not viewing this as a hobby per se, because far too many people, I think, go into podcasting thinking it's easy, thinking that they could do it, thinking that it's going to just be like a walk in the park and they could do this as some sort of side gig, when ultimately you really have to view this as your full-time job if you're going to go into it. You need to go all in on it, or you're just not going to be successful.
And it required consistency too. Ben, another of the brothers, sounds an awful lot like Brett, says,
I think we've always been, as we like to say, behind the scenes, just chopping the wood. Day in, day out, it's been a relentless pursuit of doing a great show. It was never, how could we be number 1, number 10, number 15, or whatever. We knew we had to put forward a great show, a great product each and every day.
4 years after Serial Season 1, so 2018, the landscape had shifted dramatically. Brendan Monahan.
In the early days, so much of it was about the content. It was almost like this Easter egg that you could find that so-and-so had a podcast. And over time, it's become much more commercialized.
Lex Friedman.
There's a handful of companies that control the vast majority of podcast inventory, that have the vast majority of the gigantic shows.
And this is where things start to feel hard for the purists. If podcasting started as this rebellion against traditional media gatekeepers, those same corporate behemoths were now buying up everything in sight. The stakes weren't just about money or ownership. This was about the soul of podcasting.
When the money started coming in a few years after Serial to the podcast industry and we started seeing consolidation, I thought it was positive because people were now treating it as a serious industry that was worthy of investment. But at the same time, I had a lot of concerns. We left radio behind for a reason. We wanted to get away from all the gatekeepers, away from all the content restrictions and FCC oversight, and away from program directors that would stomp an idea for reasons that may or may not have been necessary.
In other words, the credo should be creator first, says media executive and industry cartographer Evan Shapiro.
The creator is first. Put the creator first. It's risky from a traditional media perspective, but it's actually far riskier to continue doing the same safe walled garden Hollywood bullshit. What is embodied in podcasting traditionally is the creator is supreme. And the more a brand can trust in the voice of a creator and kind of like just lean back and let it happen, the more successful they're going to ultimately be.
And while major media companies acquired podcast networks and celebrities signed massive deals, some creators went another route, prioritizing genuine community connections. Jordy, the third brother, co-founder of the Midas Touch Network, says that's where their success came from.
One of the biggest things I say about the network is it's truly an egoless movement. Like, the brothers and I may be the hosts of the podcast and the founders of the network, but like, we don't view ourselves on any sort of pedestal. Like, we are right there in the weeds with the community. And it's this community that is so hungry for the receipts, for the information that they could take back to their circles, which motivates us every single day.
But it's hard to hang on to your egoless, creator-centered, community-focused ethos when all of the different delivery pipelines were becoming one pipeline. Apple had long dominated podcast distribution, but Spotify was on the move in a big way, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on acquisitions and exclusive deals. Pete Birsinger, CEO and founder of Podscribe, says there was another factor changing the industry: listeners and how they wanted to listen.
Consumption, especially with millennials, do they really want to use the Apple Podcasts app? Probably not. I think the usage is going down. But I do think it's not a tremendous amount of effort, to post. I think if anything, I think the RSS feed is probably the easiest one to post to and gives you the most flexibility and control.
When iHeart acquired Stuff Media and then Gimlet was acquired, and you started to see a domino effect of large companies saying, okay, radio is on the decline. We need to get with the program. And they started gobbling up the podcast companies. We liked that, but we questioned a lot of the decisions and were concerned that some of the old ways of thinking would creep in and start to threaten this new world that had been opened up to us.
Act 3, the Pod-demic boom and bust.
We have a new name for the coronavirus. The World Health Organization has officially called it COVID-19.
Heightened states of emergency across the nation as a number of coronavirus cases soars above 3,000.
When the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the world in March 2020, lots of people predicted disaster for podcasting. No one was commuting anymore. Everyone's routine changed. Was anyone still going to listen? But lo and behold, not only did listening bounce back, a second big podcasting bang went boom. Suddenly, everyone was home with time on their hands and stories to tell. Celebrities, laid-off professionals, bored teenagers, they all started podcasts. And one of the industry's largest podcast advertising agencies, Veritone One, had a front-row seat to this unprecedented content explosion. Hillary Ross Schaefer, another brilliant advertising buyer I sold ads to, and the company's VP in media over podcasts and YouTube, was responsible for evaluating new shows for potential advertising opportunities and witnessed this surge firsthand.
Every day, my inbox would be full of a new show announcement from every partner out there.
The challenge that we had really hit during COVID because suddenly the standard for production and people's inability to produce content where they normally would have brought this tremendous influx of new talent. And in many ways, that was positive because we saw even more attention and even more big names pouring in, which looked like success.
The numbers are kind of mind-blowing when you look at them. Sure, listeners were growing from about 100 million Americans before the pandemic to around 116 million. But new shows, they were growing way faster. In early 2020, there were roughly 850,000 podcasts out there. Just a year and a half later, over 2 million. That's more than double in less than 2 years. Yes, podcast ad money grew to over $1 billion in 2021, nearly twice what it was before the pandemic. But that spread across millions of shows. The math just wasn't mathing for creators. But Dan Granger says that there was a bigger problem than simple supply and demand.
We saw peak polarization after the murder of George Floyd.
George Floyd's death sparking protests across the country.
There was kind of a second existential threat where brands were retreating from influencer marketing and podcasting as well because they didn't know how to deal with people giving their opinions about really anything because everything had become politicized. And so we changed our focus on the podcast and made it the Media Roundtable and really set on a course to ask ourselves, why are we so divided and what is media's role in that? And what can we do about it from the standpoint of the advertising community?
And beyond all those pressures, supply outstripping demand, Americans having a harder and harder time just listening to each other. This weird shift occurred that maybe nobody would have predicted. Although when you stare at it, literally, it makes sense. Podcasts, by definition, an audio format, people started to be able to watch them.
The pandemic pushed us on to Zoom. Zoom became a podcast studio for many people. We all got very comfortable using video broadly. A lot of that gets pushed onto YouTube. Now, all of a sudden, we have a big distribution channel that's a lot more proficient at audience acquisition and sampling that you didn't have before.
You could call this the simulcast approach. So there's Alex Cooper or Joe Rogan or whomever interviewing Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, depending on the example. And sure, you could listen to it, or you could go to YouTube, enter the search term, and up pops the podcast.
But your thing is going really great. My son's a big fan of yours, Baron.
Really, Baron is?
Yeah.
But with pictures, Courtney O'Connor, a digital media strategist who oversaw the DraftKings massive podcast advertising budget, thinks it's cool.
podcast continues to evolve in meeting their listener where they are consuming. We've seen it go from mostly audio only to a really large expansion into video, and then even clipping that down into social and having a really solid footprint in really all of these media channels. And so I think it's really cool how the ecosystem continues to evolve towards their newest listener. So it's always growing.
Bryan Barletta says the way audiences engage with podcasts as audio only and with video added, it's a huge difference.
We do double the completion in Apple and Spotify than we do in YouTube.
Meaning people listen longer than they watch. So maybe this isn't a threat to traditional podcasting. Not an either or, but a both and. That's what AJ Feliciano thinks it is anyway. He's the head of the podcast network, The Roost.
Now that everybody's sort of accepted this multi-platform distribution strategy, whether it's video or audio, I call it a simulcast these days. And it's, it just feels more inclusive.
Here's Jordy from the Midas Touch Network.
It's not enough to just play the instruments. You have to really know how to play the instruments. If you're going to play the trombone, meaning if you're going to show up on Instagram and you're still posting square photos, even though they've recently redesigned to a 16:9 approach, you're 10 steps behind the game. You have to be able to adapt with the platforms as quickly as they adapt and understand consumer habits in a way that allows that orchestra to really, have that nice, beautiful sound.
But here's the $64,000 question. Was this even podcasting anymore? As more and more shows added video and platforms like YouTube became where people found their shows, we started asking ourselves, again, what exactly is a podcast anyway? This wasn't just some academic debate. For many creators and industry veterans, this identity crisis hit at the core of what they'd built. John McDermott argues strongly for maintaining the distinction between podcasts and other media formats.
Do we want to be AM radio? Do we deserve to be AM radio? I don't think so. So let's try and hold on to the word podcasting and call a YouTube show a YouTube show.
By late 2021, the warning signs were flashing bright red. Venture capital money had been geysering out of the ground. Valuations were through the roof. Problem was, the audience just wasn't growing fast enough to support all these new shows. Then 2022 hit. And reality came knocking. Networks started laying people off. Production companies shut their doors. Even Spotify, who'd been spending money like there was no tomorrow, pulled back on their podcast investments. The strongest shows survived. The pandemic podcasts that people started on a whim, many of them disappeared. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the industry growing up. Brett from the Midas Touch Podcast Network says it's important to adapt, to be willing to change.
Be okay with screwing up, right? And be okay with changing course. I think sometimes one of the biggest problems that I see with people is they do something and it's not working. But this is the way they do it. And so they do it and they do it that way and they do it that way. And I look at them and I've noticed, I see our growth in a, year period or whatever the year, whatever the time period is. And then I look at, the person who we may have done a video with or something a few months ago, whatever it may be. And I noticed they're in the same place. And I was like, if I was just in a rut, we are always adapting. We're always trying to figure out what's next. How do we make this better? How do we improve it? Is there a way to refine?
So where does all this leave podcasting in 2025? As we wrap up this middle chapter of our story. In some ways, things have never been better. We've got dedicated creators making amazing shows. The business models actually work now. And millions of loyal listeners tune in every day. But, and this is a big but, podcasting is at a crossroads. Remember that RSS feed we talked about in episode 1? That open standard that let anyone create a podcast and distribute it everywhere? It's under threat. Big platforms want exclusivity. They want content you can only get from them.
The two leading platforms for consumption being YouTube and Spotify, both of which are now heavily focused, obviously, on video. this is starting to change things. I don't know if the RSS can be saved. We have to change with technology. Video has punched its way in, ready or not.
And looking at people when they talk isn't always necessarily additive. Just ask John McDermott, who produces a daily comedy news show.
I put out a podcast 7 days a week called Daily Comedy News. It's me telling you what's happening in stand-up comedy for 10, 12 minutes a day. And I've really struggled with, okay, what's the video version of this? I have been self-describing as I'm somewhere between Troll and George Clooney. I'll let you pick where I am on the scale. There are people who are more handsome than me. There are definitely people who are younger than me. There are definitely people who are sexier than me. And is a great version of Daily Comedy News podcast, me, where I am right now in front of my orange wall and my fake window sticker. Is that a good video? It's not.
Guy Raz, host and producer of popular shows including How I Built This, is a little more philosophical about the change.
It's an evolution, as any industry matures and grows and innovators come in, it changes and you have to respond to those changes. I mean, if you look at early YouTube, it's so different from what it would become over time. I understand what's happening now around video podcasting. I mean, on How I Built This, we're evolving. We do videos.
There's always been this tension in podcasting, the scrappy DIY spirit bumping up against corporate interests. The industry's Wild West nature made it hard to make money at scale, sure. But that same freedom allowed creators to experiment in ways that just weren't possible in traditional media. As podcasting grows up, we're still trying to figure out that balance between having enough structure to build sustainable businesses and keeping enough freedom to stay creative and authentic. This democratization of media remains podcasting's most revolutionary aspect. Despite the industry's corporatization, the medium continues to offer opportunities for new voices in ways that traditional broadcasting never could. And as we look toward the future, the question becomes whether this foundational value can survive amid increasing platform control and commercialization. In our final episode, we will explore exactly what this evolution means for podcasting's future. Is this open ecosystem that defined its early years sustainable? Or is podcasting becoming something entirely different?
Podcast doesn't belong at the kids' table anymore. It's time to define it and treat it like the medium that it is. We need to make room for the old independent spirit of this channel and not pave over that, even as we make room for new formats and new technology. The soul of podcasting needs to be retained in this process.
This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road and Veritone One, where we want you to succeed in audio and creator-based media to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to Oxford Road by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to their weekly newsletter, The Influencer. The Media Roundtable would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@mediaroundtable.com. Thank you to our guests and to Haley Weiss, Ruby Mora, Bianca Gorodinsky, Ezra Fox, Mary Jane Balash, Neil Lucy, Olivia Gerving, and the team at Podcast One. This podcast was produced and edited by Sean Michael Colon, the director of the documentary Age of Audio, with additional story editing by Sean Cole and additional editing by Emily Oliver. Music by Breakmaster Cylinder. As always, influence responsibly.